I knew the exact moment I became furniture in the house I had built. It was not when they relocated my desk to the dark corridor next to the server closet to make room for a custom-built ping-pong table. It was not even when the new director of Workplace Vibe, a 25-year-old in designer sneakers, asked if I was the technician dispatched to service the copy machine. The realization landed with absolute clarity during the Series C celebration dinner at an upscale steakhouse overlooking the harbor. They were popping bottles of vintage champagne like water, toasting to the visionary genius of Julian Porter, the chief executive officer of Aegis Stream. Julian was standing on a chair, his face flushed, screaming about how he had single-handedly disrupted the paradigm and changed the face of modern commerce. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, nursing a glass of lukewarm seltzer, watching a room full of people celebrate a machine they did not know how to boot up. Most people believe tech startups are built on pure vision, passion, and endless streams of caffeine. They are wrong. Startups are built on boring, dense paperwork that nobody actually reads because they are too busy measuring their own importance in the glass reflections of high-rise offices. 8 years ago, before the sleek glass walls and the Patagonia vests, Aegis Stream was nothing but a single laptop on a card table in a damp basement that smelled of wet drywall and desperate ambition. It was just Julian and myself. I wrote the core predictive engine that now drove 90% of Aegis Stream's annual revenue. Julian provided the pizza, the marketing hype, and the overconfident sales pitches. I provided the logic. I was a doctoral candidate with massive student loans and healthy trust issues. I did not want equity that could be diluted down to nothing by subsequent venture capital rounds. I wanted absolute control over my creation. Let us trace the technical lineage. The Aegis engine was not just a collection of standard software libraries. It was a multi-layered predictive architecture that combined Bayesian inference models with real-time logistic regression to forecast consumer purchasing behavior with 94% accuracy. When Julian was pitching to the first angel investors, he claimed the system was fully autonomous. In reality, I was sitting behind a makeshift partition, manually rerouting database queries and fixing memory leaks in real time to prevent the demo server from crashing. I remember those nights clearly. The basement had a single window that looked out onto a concrete wall. When it rained, water pooled near the power strips. I would work 36-hour shifts, fueled by cheap microwave meals and a stubborn belief that the math was sound. Julian would fall asleep on a pile of cardboard boxes, dreaming of magazine covers, while I traced memory pointers and optimized index tables. When the time came to sign the formal incorporation documents, Julian was in a manic state. A boutique venture firm had offered us our first $50,000 in seed funding, and Julian saw it as a green light to start printing business cards with the title of founder and chief executive officer. The corporate attorney we hired was a friend of Julian's from college who was more interested in getting free tickets to tech conferences than reviewing the dense annexes. That was when I executed my first strategic move. I drafted the intellectual property lease agreement myself, borrowing templates from academic licensing offices. The document was titled Annex C4, a name designed to sound like a standard administrative disclosure. It explicitly stated that the underlying algorithmic model, including the source code, the data structures, and the mathematical weights, remained my personal property. Under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, I reserved all exclusive rights of reproduction, distribution, and the creation of derivative works. Aegis Stream was granted a limited, non-exclusive license to utilize this technology. Conditioned upon the payment of an annual fee of $1, the contract was structured to prevent automatic renewal. If the company failed to execute a physical renewal document and pay the $1 fee by October 1st of each calendar year, the license would automatically terminate 30 days later. On October 31st, Julian did not look twice at Annex C4. He signed the signature page with a blue felt-tip pen, tossed it to the corporate attorney, and immediately went back to explaining how our startup would reach a $100 million valuation in 5 years. For the first few years, the arrangement worked without friction. Every September, I would print out a simple invoice for $1, walk to the office manager's desk, collect a single-dollar note from the petty cash drawer, and write a manual receipt. I stored these receipts in a locked metal drawer in my desk, right next to my original doctoral thesis. To the finance department, it was a quirky accounting anomaly. To me, it was the deed to the kingdom. But as the company grew, the culture warped. The venture capitalists took control of the board of directors, and they brought in a new wave of executives who valued presentation over substance. The engineers who had built the platform were gradually pushed down the hierarchy, replaced by young recruits from elite universities who spoke in a dialect of corporate jargon I could barely comprehend. I became an anomaly. I was a man in his early 50s who preferred physical notebooks, did not participate in the mandatory corporate retreats, and openly questioned the efficiency of the new management tools. I watched as they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on modernizing the office lobby with living moss walls and espresso bars, while refusing to approve a $5,000 request to upgrade our database servers. The Series C dinner was the final confirmation. As I watched Julian douse himself in expensive champagne, surrounded by junior executives who laughed at his mediocre jokes, I knew my time as an employee was drawing to a close. Preston Foley, the newly appointed Chief Technology Officer, sat opposite me, whispering to the Vice President of Sales. They kept looking in my direction, their eyes cool and calculating. I did not need to be a predictive algorithm to know what they were planning. They saw an old coder who was costing them a high salary and holding back their plans for a complete architectural rewrite. They believed they could discard me like an old keyboard. They had no idea they were standing on a trapdoor. And I held the lever. Preston Foley arrived at Aegis-Stream with the force of a hurricane made of buzzwords. He was the kind of executive who could speak for 45 minutes about operational efficiency and technological synergy without ever mentioning a single technical concept. He had a Master of Business Administration from a prestigious university, a wardrobe of identical dark blue vests, and a history of staying at startups for 18 months before moving on to the next venture. On his first Monday, Preston gathered the engineering department in the open plan communal area. He stood in front of a whiteboard, drew a series of concentric circles, and announced his grand vision. "We are going to deprecate the current monolithic architecture," Preston said, his voice filled with corporate enthusiasm. "Our goal is a fully decentralized microservices framework driven by artificial intelligence native protocols. We need to focus on scalability, cloud-native integration, and cognitive agility. The legacy codebase is bottlenecking our growth." I sat in the back row, holding my mug of lukewarm coffee. The legacy codebase he was referring to was the Aegis engine. It was not a monolith. It was a highly optimized, modular system that currently processed transactions at a latency of 48 milliseconds, handling over $3 million in transaction volume every single hour. It was the only part of the company's technology stack that did not require a dedicated support team to keep it from crashing. "Preston," I said, raising my hand, "the current data ingestion pipeline is optimized for real-time memory caching. If you break it down into independent microservices without a centralized state manager, you will introduce database lock latency. The predictive accuracy of the model relies on immediate state validation." Preston smiled at me, the kind of condescending smile one reserves for an elderly relative who does not understand how a television remote works. "I appreciate the historical perspective, Howard," Preston said. "But the industry has moved past static state models. We need younger energy, fresh eyes, and modern frameworks. We are bringing in a team of consultants from a boutique agency next week to begin the transition." The following afternoon, Preston called me into his office. It was a corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass windows designed so that the entire engineering team could watch who was entering and leaving. He did not offer me a seat. Instead, he leaned against the edge of his standing desk, crossing his arms. "Howard, let's talk about your future at Aegis-Stream," Preston began, looking at his smartwatch. "You've done a wonderful job keeping the lights on. But as we pivot to the new architecture, we need to transition you to a different role. We want you to step into the position of Head of Legacy Maintenance." "Head of Legacy Maintenance," I repeated, keeping my voice entirely flat. "Yes," Preston said, beaming. It is a vital role. You will be responsible for documenting the historical context of the codebase, compiling the tribal knowledge, and writing the technical manuals. We need you to prepare the system for the transition. We will also need you to hand over all administrative credentials and root database access to the new engineering leads by Friday afternoon. It was a classic corporate maneuver. They wanted me to write the instruction manual for my own execution, hand over the keys to the kingdom, and then sit quietly in a corner fixing minor bugs until they could terminate my employment without any operational disruption. I felt a wave of anger, but I did not let it show on my face. Instead, I thought about the legal framework. As an employee who had been with the company since its inception, this sudden demotion and reduction in responsibilities constituted constructive discharge under local employment law. Furthermore, under the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, which was codified at Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101, companies with a certain employee count were prohibited from conducting mass layoffs or significant restructurings that targeted long-term staff without proper notice and compensation. But I knew that pursuing a standard wrongful termination or labor dispute was a slow, expensive process that would only yield a modest settlement. I had a much larger lever in my desk drawer. "I understand the request, Preston," I said, looking him directly in the eyes. "You want a complete documentation of the core algorithm, a technical handover, and full administrative access by Friday." "Exactly," Preston said, clearly relieved that I was not going to argue. "I knew we could count on you to be a team player, Howard. Let's get those credentials transferred, and we can discuss your transition package next month." I walked out of his glass office and back to my desk next to the server closet. The junior engineers were looking at me with expressions of pity. They had seen the interaction in the glass fishbowl, and they knew what it meant. To them, I was the old veteran being quietly put out to pasture. I sat down at my workstation, opened a clean text document, and began to write. But I was not writing a user manual for the consultants. I was compiling a detailed log of every technical asset I had created. I pulled the version control histories, the server deployment logs, and the database schemas. I was creating a dossier of ownership. Then I opened my personal records and checked the date. It was of October 15th. The annual lease agreement for the Aegis engine required Aegis Stream to execute the renewal document and pay the $1 fee by October 1st. I checked my personal bank records and the company's general ledger. The transaction had not occurred. There was no invoice, no receipt, and no payment. For the first time in 8 years, the company's finance department, distracted by the preparation for the $50 million Series D funding round, had failed to pay the rent. As of October 1st, the license had expired. And under the terms of the agreement, after a 14-day grace period that had ended on October 15th, the license was officially terminated. Aegis Stream was now operating its entire business on unlicensed intellectual property. And I was no longer just an employee. I was an unlicensed landlord. Having administrative access to the entire network is a powerful thing, especially when the management team is too incompetent to realize they should have revoked it weeks ago. While Preston assumed I was spending my days documenting the database tables, I was navigating the company's secured document repository. I was looking for the commercial agreements that drove the business. That was when I discovered the folder labeled Project Titan. I opened the main contract file and felt my pulse quicken as I read the details. It was a master services agreement with the largest retail conglomerate in North America, a corporate giant with thousands of physical stores and a massive online presence. The contract was a $200 million deal, structured over 5 years, with a pilot launch scheduled to begin in less than 3 weeks. I scrolled down to the technical annexes. The services promised to the conglomerate were described in glowing marketing-driven terms: real-time predictive customer behavior modeling, dynamic inventory allocation, and customized search intent optimization. But when I looked at the technical API endpoints and the data formats, I recognized them instantly. It was the Aegis engine. The company was not just using my algorithm to run their own platform. They were white-labeling it, packaging it as a standalone product, and selling it directly to a third party. I turned my attention to Section 12 of the contract, which detailed the intellectual property warranties. In plain, legally binding language, Aegis-Stream represented and warranted that it possessed sole, exclusive, and unencumbered ownership of all software, source code, and algorithms utilized in the delivery of the services. They explicitly stated that no third-party licenses were required to operate the core technology. It was a multi-million-dollar lie. Aegis-Stream did not own the software. They had been leasing it from me for $1 a year, and that lease had officially terminated. If the client discovered that the core technology running their pilot program was unlicensed, the contract would be void, the pilot would be canceled, and Aegis-Stream would face catastrophic lawsuits for fraud and breach of contract. I spent the entire weekend running detailed comparisons. I downloaded the source code currently deployed on the Project Titan production servers and compared it to the original code I had written on my laptop in that damp basement 8 years ago. I ran a standard diff tool. The result was a 98% match. The consultants brought in by Preston had not rewritten the system. They had not built a new microservices framework. All they had done was wrap my core predictive engine in a modern API layer. He's changing the names of the external functions to make it look like a new product. It was the software equivalent of putting a new coat of paint on a classic sports car and claiming they had built the engine from scratch. To make matters more comical, they had not even cleaned the code. As I scrolled through the production files running on the Titan servers, I found my original developer comments still embedded in the logic. In line 412, there was a comment I had written in 2015. Temporary fix for memory leak, remember to buy cat food. In line 874, another comment read, if this query fails, Julian owes me a beer. They had deployed my personal, raw code directly to a $200 million client, complete with my personal jokes and notes. Under the federal copyright laws of the United States, specifically Title 17 of the United States Code, the unauthorized reproduction and distribution of copyrighted software carries severe statutory damages. Because the lease agreement had terminated, every single transaction processed by Aegis-Stream's servers and every deployment of the code to the Project Titan environment constituted an active instance of copyright infringement. I sat in my home office on Sunday night, the glow of the monitors reflecting off my glasses, and took a sip of water. I compiled the diff reports, the server logs, the Project Titan contract, and the original lease agreement into a single encrypted directory. I also pulled the corporate disclosures that Julian had submitted to the venture capital partners for the upcoming Series D funding round. The funding round was scheduled to close in 10 days, bringing in $50 million of new capital at a valuation of $400 million. In the disclosure documents, under penalty of perjury, Julian had checked the box, confirming that Aegis-Stream owned 100% of its core intellectual property, with no active disputes or licensing liabilities. Julian and Preston were not just trying to push me out of the company. They were committing securities fraud, misrepresenting their assets to institutional investors, and exposing their largest client to massive legal liability. The arrogance was staggering. They believed that because I was a quiet engineer who did not speak up in meetings, I would simply accept my demotion, hand over the administrative passwords, and disappear into retirement. They assumed that the paperwork signed during the chaotic early days of the company was irrelevant, that a founding coder could be easily replaced by a team of younger, cheaper developers. They did not realize that they had built their entire $400 million house of cards on land that I owned, and I was about to refuse to renew the lease. On Monday evening, I drove to a quiet, dimly lit tavern in East Cambridge, far away from the glassy high-rise offices of the tech district. I was meeting Valerie Stone, a former classmate from my graduate school days, who had gone on to become one of the most formidable intellectual property litigators in the state. I sat in a corner booth waiting for Valerie's arrival. When she arrived, she shook off the cold autumn rain, ordered a black coffee, and looked at the thick physical folder I had placed on the table. "You said you had a compliance issue, Howard," Valerie said, pulling the documents from the folder. "What has the company done now?" "They are trying to push me out," I said quietly. But before they do, I want you to look at our founding documents. Valerie spent the next 20 minutes reading. She read the original lease agreement from 2015. She examined the physical receipts for the $1 annual payments. She compared the Project Titan contract with the code diff reports I had compiled. Finally, she reviewed the draft disclosures for the $50 million Series D funding round. As she reached the final page, a slow smile spread across her face, followed by a soft, dry laugh. "Howard," Valerie said, setting the papers down. "This is not a lawsuit, this is an execution. You do not just have leverage, you own the foundation of their entire business, and they literally forgot to pay the rent." "What is the legal status?" I asked. "It is clean," Valerie explained, leaning forward. "Your lease agreement is airtight. It explicitly states that the copyright to the algorithm remains with you and that the license terminates automatically if the renewal is missed. Since they failed to pay the $1 by October 1st, and the grace period expired on October 15th, they are currently using your intellectual property without a license. Under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, they are committing willful copyright infringement, and by representing to their largest client and their new investors that they own this technology. Julian Porter is committing securities fraud, violating his fiduciary duty to the shareholders, and violating local penal code regulations if any signatures were forged or falsely certified. "What do we do?" I asked. "We do nothing," Valerie said, her eyes flashing. "Not yet. Let them launch the Project Titan pilot. Let them sign the Series D funding papers. The more they rely on your code, the deeper the hole they dig for themselves. I will file the formal copyright registration in your name tomorrow morning to ensure the chain of title is recorded at the federal office. In the meantime, you go back to work, keep your head down, and wait for my signal." I returned to the office on Tuesday, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. I sat at my desk, quietly going through the motion of writing basic documentation, while Preston's consultants spent their time in meetings discussing agile methodologies. On Wednesday afternoon, I was in the break room brewing a cup of tea when Toby Jenkins, a talented junior developer fresh out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, walked in. He looked around nervously to ensure we were alone before speaking. "Howard," Toby whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I need to show you something. It didn't sit right with me." "What is it, Toby?" I asked. "In the engineering all-hands meeting this morning, Preston showed the team the core predictive model," Toby said. "He claimed that he had spent the weekend refactoring the legacy logic, simplifying what he called our clumsy founding codebase into a streamlined heuristic." I took a sip of my tea. "Is that what he said?" "Yes," Toby nodded. "But I looked at the repository history. He didn't rewrite anything, Howard. He just renamed the variables. He took your function for user velocity and renamed it customer journey speed. He changed database query latency to platform response time. He is claiming he wrote the algorithm himself to impress the board before the funding round closes." A slow, cold anger settled in my chest. Plagiarism was one thing, but Preston's arrogance in claiming my life's work as his own weekend project was the final straw. They were not just trying to replace me. They were trying to erase me. "Thank you, Toby," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "I appreciate you telling me. Keep your head down, do your work, and do not mention this to anyone else." "Are you going to let him get away with it?" Toby asked. "No," I said calmly. "I am going to let him walk directly into the wall." I went back to my workstation and messaged Valerie. I explained the internal plagiarism and the fact that Preston was claiming authorship of the algorithm to the engineering team. Valerie's response was immediate. "Perfect. The investor diligence meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 in the morning. They have requested a final sign-off on the intellectual property assets. I will prepare the formal notice of lease termination and copyright infringement. We will deliver it live in the boardroom." The boardroom of Aegis was situated on the top floor, featuring sweeping views of the Charles River. A massive mahogany table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs. When I walked in on Tuesday morning, the air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and corporate tension. Around the table sat the board of directors, including two senior partners from a prominent venture capital firm on Sand Hill Road, Julian Porter, Prest Foley, and the company's corporate counsel, Stuart Cole. Julian frowned as I entered. He gestured to the corner of the room. "Howard, we are in the middle of finalizing our Series D disclosures," Julian said, his voice tight. "We only have a few minutes. You are here to confirm that the tech stack is stable and proprietary, correct?" "Actually, Julian, I am here to discuss the compliance audit," I said, walking to the head of the table. I did not sit down. Instead, I plugged my laptop into the conference projector. The screen flickered to life, displaying a document titled Annex C4. "What is this?" Preston asked, scoffing. "We don't have time for legacy documentation reviews." "This," I said, addressing the venture capitalists, "is the intellectual property lease agreement signed by Julian Porter on behalf of AegisStream in 2015. Under the terms of this agreement, I retained full and exclusive ownership of the core predictive commerce algorithm, licensing it to the company for a fee of $1 per year." Julian laughed, though it sounded strained. "Howard, that was a boilerplate paper from 8 years ago. We have an assignment of inventions clause in your employment contract." "My employment contract was signed 3 weeks after incorporation," I replied. "This lease agreement predates that contract. The algorithm was created prior to my employment, making it excluded property. Furthermore, the lease explicitly states that if the company fails to execute a physical renewal and pay the annual fee by October 1st of any calendar year, the license terminates." Stuart Cole, the corporate attorney, leaned forward, his face pale. He began typing furiously on his laptop. I clicked to the next slide, I continued. "A scan of the company's financial ledgers. AegisStream failed to renew the lease and failed to pay the $1 fee for this year. The grace period expired on October 15th. As of today, the license is terminated. AegisStream is operating on unlicensed software." "This is ridiculous," Preston shouted, standing up. "I refactored that code myself. It is our proprietary technology." "Preston," I said, looking at him, "you renamed the variables. The underlying mathematics, the database schemas, and the predictive weights are identical to the code I wrote in 2015. In fact, the code currently running on the Project Titan servers still contains my personal developer comments, including jokes about my cat." I clicked to the third slide. It was a breakdown of copyright infringement damages and breach of contract liabilities compiled by Valerie. "You have deployed this unlicensed software to Project Titan, your largest client," I explained to the board. "In the Titan contract, you represented that you own this technology. You do not. If I contact their legal department today, they will terminate the contract for fraud. Additionally, you are about to close a $50 million funding round based on false disclosures. That is a direct violation of federal securities laws." The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Stuart Cole slowly closed his laptop. He looked at Julian, then at the venture capitalists. "He is correct," Cole whispered, his voice shaking. "I have reviewed the founding files. Annex C4 was never superseded. The lease expired, and the grace period has passed. Without a valid license, we do not own the core intellectual property. We are in active breach of the Titan contract, and the Series D disclosures are inaccurate." The venture capitalists turned their cold, analytical eyes toward Julian and Preston. The atmosphere in the room froze. "What do you want, Howard?" the senior venture capital partner asked, his voice calm and deadly. I slid a document across the mahogany table. "This is a new licensing agreement," I said. "I am transferring the copyright of the algorithm to Vance Logic Limited Liability Company, which I own. AegisStream will pay a licensing fee equal to 15% of all gross revenue generated by the predictive engine, including all revenue from Project Titan. The license is non-transferable and will terminate immediately if any attempt is made to reverse engineer the code." 15% of gross? Julian gasped, his voice cracking. "That destroys our profit margins." "Then I suggest you write your own predictive engine," I replied. "Preston is a visionary architect. He claims he wrote the base logic during a hackathon last weekend. I am sure he can rebuild the entire system from scratch before the Titan pilot launches in 48 hours. Preston slowly sank back into his chair, his face completely devoid of color. He knew, and everyone in the room knew, that he could not write a single line of functional code. The venture capitalists did not hesitate. They were not going to let a $200 million client contract and a $50 million funding round collapse to protect the egos of Julian and Preston. They forced Julian to sign the agreement. By Friday afternoon, the corporate restructuring had begun. Preston Foley was terminated for gross negligence. Julian was stripped of operational control, kept on as a figurehead to avoid raising red flags with the investors. I packed my laptop and walked out of the building. I did not take any boxes or look back at the glass offices. 3 months have passed since that day. I now work from a quiet home office with a view of a wooded garden. Vance Logic Limited Liability Company receives quarterly licensing checks that far exceed my former annual salary. Aegis Stream's new engineering team is terrified of the codebase. They treat the Aegis engine like a sacred relic, afraid to modify a single line for fear of breaking the system. When a bug occurs, they do not attempt to fix it. They call my consultancy firm, and I charge them $500 an hour to resolve the issue. Sometimes people advise against burning bridges in your career. They tell you to maintain relationships and compromise. That is poor advice. Sometimes, you must burn the bridge to show the people crossing it that they were only standing on it with your consent. I am no longer the employee. I am the landlord, and the rent is always paid on time.